most of you. If the material that we're about to go over is like brand new, a lot of this you should have gotten in anatomy and physiology or exercise physiology or general nutrition or something like that. So I don't think you should run down the hall screaming if you don't recognize some of this stuff. But if you don't recognize some of it, then just know that there's going to be a steep learning curve at first. But once you get up to speed on certain things, you'll be all right. Okay, so we start with the discussion around bioenergetics. Now wait, you all have access to these notes. Like, I give you these notes, so you don't have to write down what's on here. You can write down extra stuff, intellectual gems that I drop that aren't on the PowerPoint slide. But you have access to the PowerPoint slides. You can print these off. You can bring them. You can do whatever you want with them. Okay. So bioenergetics is just what it sounds like, the ability to convert foodstuffs into biologically useful forms of energy. Bioenergetics is an entire field. It's near and dear to my heart. I love the idea of just saying, like, I can take these things that are outside of my body, consume them, and in some way they provide me the ability to do mechanical work and power physiologic processes. And so there's a whole science behind bioenergetics, and this is a lot of what performance nutrition, what a lot of people think performance nutrition is basically bioenergetics, right? How much energy is this going to give me? What am I going to be able to do off of it? And we'll see as the term goes along how much more complex performance nutrition is. But we have to start with the basics, which is bioenergetics. So this is the ability to perform work. This work is dictated by the demands of the sport or the exercise or the task that you're trying to do. There's also a lot of, there might not be, for example, mechanical work going on when you're sitting on the couch, but there's a lot of electrical and chemical work going on, right? Our heart is still beating, our liver is still functioning, our lungs are still breathing. Transportation is the delivery systems that are used to get nutrients to the tissues that need them, right? So how do we deliver nutrients to our legs when we're running or to our arms when we're lifting or those sorts of things? All right. So the two things all of you should be familiar with A&P and basic biology and those types of things, are two kinds of chemical reactions, endergonic and exergonic. And this is really the key to understanding bioenergetics, because endergonic reactions are chemical reactions that require energy input. And when that chemical bond is formed by putting energy into it, we can store that energy to be released at a later time to drive other chemical processes, right? So we're just trading, we're converting energy from one form to another so that it can be used in the way that we want to use it. That's an endergonic reaction, right? So an exergonic reaction is a reaction that occurs where there's a breakdown in chemicals. There's breakdown in a molecule that releases energy. And then we can harness that energy to drive tasks, chemical tasks, mechanical tasks, those types of things, right? So the example that I use here is the currency of energy in the body is ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. And the ability to produce ATP efficiently and the ability to use ATP efficiently is one of the biggest adaptations we get from regular training or from eating the right foods at the right time. They provide the substrate that can be turned into ATP. Those require endergonic reactions to build up that ATP. But that ATP at that point that it's built up stores energy that then we can couple to reactions like skeletal muscle contraction. So in order to drive skeletal muscle contraction, you require the production of ATP, and we break ATP to go back to, so the D here is diphosphate, the T here is triphosphate. So if you break one of these phosphates off and you end up with a DP plus a free phosphate, you release that energy and you tie it to some sort of movement or action or chemical response, right? So here's what ATP looks like. In this, we're looking at ATP here, which is an adenosine backbone with a ribose sugar and 3 phosphates. You don't need to know the organic chemistry, the look of it, or you don't need to, I'm not going to hold you to the chemical structure that's in this model. But what I do want you to appreciate is that there are these 3 phosphate groups that are here. And these phosphate groups store energy. And when the bond is broken between this last phosphate and the second to last phosphate, we end up with a DP, or adenosine diphosphate, plus what's called an inorganic phosphate. Now, a lot of meeting a certain amount of work demand is being able to produce enough ATP efficiently to meet that work demand, right? So when we're exercising, we're constantly putting this P back on to ADP to form ATP, and then turning around and breaking it right off to release energy to perform the work that we're trying to perform. Right? All right. Now, one of the most important things, I'm going to try this. That's not important. I'm going to try this little pad thing to see if I can draw. Then I can record. This is how much I care about online students. You listen. Huh? That's pretty ugly looking.
Did you just get that later?
Yeah. Because I kept getting feedback about how whenever I would draw on the board, people online couldn't hear it. My YouTube views are through the roof, man.
Are you in the 20s?
Tons of subs, tons of,
How'd you get 20?
what do all the vloggers say? Click like down below.
Yeah.
Yeah, subscribe, click like down below. Okay, look how cool this is. You just hover this pen over and it moves the mouse. Now, if I want to draw something like the fact that if this is really important. We make ATP on demand, all right? So if you're at rest, ATP level is here. If you're at exercise, you may think to yourself, well, ATP must be through the roof because ATP levels must go up because now I'm exercising. But that is not the case. It still stays within this area and stays level. Now, the reason why ATP stays level, even though we're exercising, is why? Because of increased what? So if these two things, if the absolute values are staying the same, right? But we know that we're producing and using more ATP here.
So you're breaking it down.
Yeah, exactly. So it's building it up faster, but it's also breaking it down faster. So this is a really important concept, which is that we don't store ATP. Okay? So you don't eat food in order to store ATP. You eat food to store glucose and to store protein and to store fat, so that when it's needed, it can be broken down to meet the demand of ATP. Okay? So in this scenario over here, we have, oh boy, we have what's called increased ATP turnover. So you're making a lot more of it, but you're also using a lot more of it. Well, that was fun. Okay. All right, so we make this on demand, and we have cellular machinery that takes the inorganic phosphate and adds it to ADP so that it can be ATP so that it can be used to meet the demands of the cell. And this is just continuing all the time. Depending on the circumstances that we put our body under, we can increase or decrease the turnover. But we don't store ATP. And one of the best things about audio lectures is that I always ask, always on the first test, do we store ATP when we eat? Does ATP levels go up when we exercise? These types of things. And like 50% of the class will miss it. Even though it's like, I'm telling you this right now. It's unbelievable. Okay, so ATP gets broken down by an enzyme called ATPase. So are we familiar with the role of enzymes? All right. So enzymes are just other molecules that facilitate certain chemical reactions. Right? So if you have ATP, you can't get it to ADP plus inorganic phosphate and release this energy unless you have this enzyme called ATPase. Okay? So we break down ADP to ADP and PI, it releases energy, and then we couple that energy to whatever work, cellular work that we're trying to do. So this model of muscle contraction is a great example of that. Those of you that took A&P already will know this should kind of be familiar. It's called what's it called? What is it called? It's like the Arm and Hammer model or something.
Yeah.
What is that called? Cross-bridge model? Anyways, yes. I think it is. Anyways, so basically what you have is you have a thick myosin filament and a thin actin filament. And these two things need to combine and move along each other to shorten the muscle, and that's a skeletal muscle contraction. And in order to do so, to move the power stroke, what's called the power stroke, the thing that actually shortens the muscle, you have to have ATP. And for actin and myosin to actually release from each other, you also have to have ATP, right? This is what rigor mortis is. Rigor mortis is when someone that's dead, or an animal, when they're dead, they're not regenerating ATP anymore, and they end up having like full body contraction that basically can't be broken because their muscles won't release, their actin and myosin filaments aren't releasing from each other. Right? So the power with which you can contract a muscle and the speed at which you can contract that muscle and the endurance and the number of times you can contract that muscle with the required power and speed are dependent on the amount of ATP and the ability to make these cross bridges and do these types of things, right? And there's different muscle fiber types that have different abilities to do this. There's a motor unit, there's a neural input, but for the purposes of what we're discussing right now, we're talking about the role of ATP, which is bound to the myosin head. Does anybody remember? So we basically have an actin binding site that's blocked by a protein called troponin. Does anyone remember what moves troponin out of the way so the two can lock in together? What mineral? Calcium. Yeah. So calcium binds tropomyosin. It makes the actin twist. It exposes the myosin and actin binding site. It allows the muscle to combine together. And then we hydrolyze ATP using ATPase ATP goes from ATP to ADP plus inorganic phosphate, and we use that energy to conduct the power stroke. That's what leads to muscle contraction. All right? Same thing is occurring in an isometric contraction, right? So if I'm just holding a bunch of weight like this, but I'm not shortening or lengthening my muscle, that muscle has to be bound together and release, and bound together and release at different times in a cyclical fashion that allows me to hold that weight still and maintain that skeletal muscle length. Does that make sense? And when you can't do that anymore, what happens? Right?
Does that make you start shaking if you hold it?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, so the reason, what I would say, if I actually thought about that, what I would suggest is that you start shaking because you're not coordinating that release and binding cycle as well anymore. That makes sense? Because you're running out of ATP. All right. Now, despite what I just said, which is that ATP levels doesn't really change. Initially, there's a tiny little drop in ATP, and that's an important signal that we need to make more ATP, right? So this is just a basic thermostat sort of biological feedback system, right? So people understand that analogy? So when you have a thermostat, you set it at 68 degrees. And once it gets to 70, the air kicks on and brings it down to 66. But once it gets to 66, the air kicks off and the air rises back up to 70 before it kicks down. And the average of all that is that you have 68 degrees. Right? That's called a negative feedback loop. So it's taking information from the system and responding to that information based on what it said. Very common physiologic theme. We're going to talk about it a lot this term. But basically, you can get this initial drop in ATP that tells the system, we need to respond immediately and bring this back up. Right? But the reality is that it doesn't really change. The ATP level doesn't change. Or it may change for just like a millisecond before certain systems kick in to replenish the ATP and meet the demand that you're placing on it. Does that make sense? So think of something like, and when I'm talking about the speed at which this, can occur, think about a vertical jump or a power clean, right? You're talking about really powerful movements that are taking way less than a second. And you're generating an enormous amount of force in a very, very short amount of time based on demand. So as soon as you put weight on that system and you send the signal, we need to lift this heavy-ass weight as quickly as possible, right? You respond by generating enough ATP to produce that movement. Now, of course, you have to have enough ATPase and muscular strength and motor neuron input and all the different types of things. And one of the things about training is we adapt to those signals to become stronger so that we can produce those types of movements faster. The same thing is occurring, though, even though it's not fast. The same thing occurs when you're trying to maintain a particular running pace, say in a race, right? If you start to become inefficient or you start to lose the ability to meet the demand, you don't just seize up like you have rigor mortis. What happens? What happens when you get tired? You slow down. Because that's the rate at which your body's energy systems can meet the demand. And that can be frustrating sometimes because you're thinking my mind wants to go, but my legs aren't there. Right? And there's all these different, so we need to understand these different types of things. Now, the resynthesis of ATP, so taking ADP and forming it back into ATP so it can be used again, what type of reaction would that fall under? endergonic, right? Because we have to put energy into the system in order to create this. Now, ATP is basically the energy currency of the cell, right? So like, and what I mean, that analogy is apt because we don't like actually trade goods and services anymore. We trade goods and services through a common medium, which is money, right? And this is the same thing that's going on in a cell. So we have ways to generate ATP, and we have a bunch of different stuff to use ATP. But those things don't always match up, so the common language between them is ATP. Right? So if we can convert a stored glucose molecule, and we can send that through a process called glycolysis, and that creates energy that allows for the endergonic reaction of ATP to take place. Now that ATP can go and meet any kind of demand that the cell needs from an energy standpoint. And this is so much more efficient than having to tie every chemical reaction in the cell to a particular nutrient and a particular individual reaction of breaking down that nutrient to make something happen. Does that make sense? So we have this common language that we're using. So we use nutrients to build up ATP, and we use ATP to drive cellular reactions and mechanical work. Right? And that balance is critical to understanding why we eat certain things under certain circumstances and why those are even either enhance performance or limit performance or pull back on performance. Right? So a big part of bioenergetics is how do we take foodstuffs and get it into the body, and then how do we break it down to produce ATP so that we can turn right around and use the ATP that we just built endergonically, exergonically to drive work, cellular work. All right? So there's three main pathways that we use to accomplish this. And we're going to break each one of these down over the next couple days. So creatine phosphate is one of the energy systems that allows for the synthesis of ATP, anaerobic glycolysis, and oxidative phosphorylation as well. These are the three main energy systems. Some of this stuff, like I added this. No textbook slide is going to have this in there. Anyways. Thank you to those that chuckled at that. So we're going to talk about these, but these are a lot of times the main energy systems that we talk about when we're talking about producing power. And each one of them has payoffs, and each one of them has limitations. And depending on the situation that you're placing yourself under and the demands of what you're trying to accomplish from a work standpoint, you're going to use these, I'm not going to say interchangeably, but to various degrees. All right? One of the things that I'm going to push you to accept this term is that when these things are presented to you in biology or in some other classes, they're presented as three distinct systems. You do your creatine phosphate until it goes, and then you do your anaerobic glycolysis until it can't keep up. Then you kick into your oxidative phosphorylation, and that's your long-term energy, right? The reality is that all three of these are working all the time, but their relative contributions are going to change based on your capacity to meet exercise demand, your efficiency and economy and the movements that you're trying to perform, as well as the demands that are of the actual task you're trying to do, right? So a basketball player is using all of these things all the time. Think of somebody that jogs back on defense, then sprints on a fast break, then jumps to do a layup. That's all of these things in varying degrees all at the same time. And you have to have nutrients in the system to meet that. You also have to train each one of these systems with specific activities and then eat the right nutrition in order to recover to that training stimulus. And then you can build up and increase the capacity of each of these for performance, right? So good training programs will be broken down to train the creatine phosphate system, the anaerobic glycolysis system, the oxidative phosphorylation system, because all of them help each other, but all of them are going to allow you to move through these different energy levels in complex movements in a more efficient way and have higher performance, quicker recovery, all these different types of things. All right? All right, so we'll stop there today, and we'll pick up here